Okay. We're going to go back in time. Okay. I wanted to just, in the last half an hour, we're going to do the 3 units that we were going to do today. Just watch. It's going to be okay. First of all, we were talking about dignity and democracy, of course. What I wanted you to do, and I do want to be clear that there is a method to this. I mean, I think it's really important to spend time on the basic principles and the difficult questions. The rest of it sort of falls into place once you understand the big questions. So that's what we spent the first part of the class talking about. I just want to ask you, this is, and as you know, I'll make these available so that it'll make more sense. But I just wanted to sort of say quickly about the relationship between dignity and democracy. And I wanted to ask you to think about this as the beginning of a list, but I just wanted to ask you to think about, when we talk about dignity and democracy, two really big words, what are the specific democratic rights, or what are the specific dignity rights that are related to our status as citizens in a democracy, right? So when we talk about dignity rights in the context of democracy or participatory dignity, what are the specific rights that we mean? So we were talking earlier about voting, but which is an important one, but not the only one. So just to think about, what are all the things that, all the aspects of dignity that need to be respected in order to have the democracy functioning properly, is one way to do it. Okay, skip all that. Just wanted you to see excerpts from 3 cases that sort of tie some of these issues together. This is from India. Human development is more than the elimination of poverty, but also allows individuals to lead a life with dignity, with a view to participate in the governmental process so as to enable them to preserve their identity and culture. What I want you to see here is, you know very well about sort of Indian jurisprudence about the right to live with dignity and basically what we would call for shorthand social and economic rights and all that kind of stuff. What I want you to see here is the connection, the fluidity between social and economic rights, how we live with dignity on the one hand, and participation. The part of the purpose of protecting people's social and economic rights is not only so that they can live decently as a person, not only so that they can fully develop their personality and thrive and make decisions about their lives, but also so that they can participate in society. Because part of the problem with poverty and extreme poverty is that it marginalizes, it ostracizes, and it keeps people away from the middle where democracy happens. So that's a case that sort of articulates that relationship well. This is another case from Germany. The basic law is based on the concept of the value and dignity of the human being that is capable of being free. Seen that before. By giving all citizens the right to decide upon the persons and subjects of public authority, the basic law guarantees a human rights core to the principle of democracy. This core is rooted in human dignity. So here you have sort of a structural way of describing the relationship between dignity and democracy. And then this is from South Africa, a case about voting rights. In South Africa, like India, the Constitution is written in part for a transformative purpose, right? A post-apartheid, post-colonial, post-whatever constitution. And I say whatever in the sense that many, many constitutions around the world, the vast majority, are post some kind of trauma, whether it's colonialism or war or apartheid in the case of South Africa. And they're written as transformative documents. And so they use this idea of dignity in a way to shift gears, just as the UDHR did. And this is a case specifically about voting rights, the voting rights of people in prisons. people in prison were claiming that they had lost their liberty, but they shouldn't lose their dignity right to vote. The universality of the franchise is important not only for nationhood and democracy, but the vote of each and every citizen is a badge of dignity and of personhood. Quite literally, it says that everybody counts. In a country of great disparities of wealth and power, whoever we are, whether rich or poor, exalted or disgraced, we all belong to the same democratic South African nation, and our destinies are intertwined in a single interactive polity. So you can see dignity, sort of the idea of dignity, as we've been talking about, doing all that work in terms of sort of structuring the democracy. So I want to encourage you to think about all these different aspects of the questions that we were talking about, just from specific cases. This is, and we talked yesterday about the indivisibility of rights. And I want to sort of emphasize that when we talk about the indivisibility or the interrelationship or the interdependence of rights, we mean not only the family of civil and political rights and the family of social and economic and cultural rights, but their interconnections between the two, as we saw in the case from India. In the UDHR, social and economic rights are written about not very much. We see a reference to sort of the dignity of work and remuneration worthy of human dignity for work, the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of each person and their family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care, and necessary social services. So the kind of list you start to see, and none of this is fleshed out in the UDHR, it's just sort of listed there. You can compare lists like that when you see them in cases with, for instance, Francis Corley Mullen, which has also sort of a list. And if you look at that list, it talks about both social, what you might think of as social and economic rights, that is like clothing and shelter, I think they talk about, but also what you might call sort of full development of the personality rights, like materials for reading and writing, which is also in that Francis Corley Mullen list. In the UDHR, you have the right to education and a right to culture, a right to participate in cultural activities. So these are some of the social and economic and cultural rights. SEC stands for social and economic and cultural rights in the UDHR. This is a link to the International Covenant. This is obviously the primary document that really spells out the sort of basic body of social and economic and cultural rights. So we don't have time right now to go through them, but I encourage you to just click on this or find it and just skim the rights that are listed there, and you'll see sort of this how it was thought of in the 1960s and 70s, actually. What you will notice there is an omission of anything relating to the environment and anything relating to climate, as well as other things. As you go through the list, you might see other things that you would have thought that you might have thought should be included, but that were not. So just take a look at that list. In 1993, the United Nations organized something called the World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna, and it produced the Vienna Declaration and Program of Action. And it mentions dignity in a few important ways. First of all, it just mentions it in the Program of Action on equality, dignity, and tolerance. The provision actually doesn't talk about dignity, it's just called dignity, but it's interesting how dignity and equality and tolerance are sort of interconnected, at least in the heading. The World Conference on Human Rights recognizes the inherent dignity and the unique contribution of Indigenous people to the development and plurality of society. So this is one example where we're seeing the connection to specific groups of people and sort of again, going back to the conversation we had earlier about equality, not suggesting that they have more or less dignity than anybody else, but just as a group that there is the recognition of their dignity. And the World Conference on Human Rights affirms that extreme poverty and social exclusion constitute a violation of human dignity. And again, just to make that point, look at the connection between extreme poverty on the one hand, and social exclusion on the other, that they're sort of interconnected because extreme poverty contributes to social exclusion. And of course, social exclusion is a problem from a democratic perspective, right? So just to sort of see how those things relate to each other. I also wanted to mention the Sustainable Development Goals, which mention dignity very, very little. But again, like the Canadian Charter, like other things, like in a way the Indian Constitution, arguably, to some extent, even though dignity is not mentioned explicitly or prominently, it's all about dignity. And it's all about sort of, you can see here in the development goals that some of these are specifically procedural, and many of them are about what we would sort of put in the category of social and economic rights. I just wanted you to take a look at that for a moment. Before COVID, there was some indication that we were actually on track in certain ways to accomplish these goals. COVID sort of made things more difficult, but I had mentioned yesterday the recent case from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights about climate justice, taking an explicitly human rights-based approach to the climate emergency. And when you take a human rights-based approach to something like the climate emergency, not that there's other things like it, but to the climate emergency, you end up with passages like this, and this is too much to read on the slide, but just to sort of give you some of the passages that just talk about the way that climate change impacts various human rights and the way they're impacted in very interdependent and interconnected ways, right? Flood comes through, you can't grow crops, you don't have income, you don't have food, that leads to illness, that leads to inability to, for education, et cetera, et cetera. Recognizing also not only physical health impacts, but also emotional health impacts, and recognizing also in turn climatic disasters can result in irreparable losses of sense of belonging and put cultural heritage sites at risk. So that notion again of individual, the importance of community to individual dignity. Again, we're not islands, we're all part of multiplicities of communities. And this case recognizes the importance of belonging to a community. And when climate disasters produce, dispersed populations produce climate migration, which is an enormous, enormous, enormous global problem. It's a problem in all kinds of ways, but for the individuals, one of the ways in which it's manifested is that loss of sense of belonging if you're no longer a part of your geographic community or the community of people from whom you benefit and gain your dignity. So just wanted to mention that. The only thing I want to say about this is if we're all equal in dignity and rights, it shouldn't matter if you're particularly vulnerable or not. So at a certain level, inherent dignity is equal for everybody, as we talked about. It doesn't matter that you're vulnerable to certain things or not. The importance of this is simply in what, are you familiar? There's a word that I used yesterday, but didn't talk about it. But are you familiar with the concept of positive and negative rights? Yeah, maybe a little bit. Historically, there's been sort of a division between those two. I won't go into that, but what I'll say is that the issue about people in vulnerable situations people can be vulnerable in all kinds of ways, right? There's no hierarchy. It's just that some people are vulnerable in more ways or more permanently than others. But people can be vulnerable to dignity degradation or diminution or violations in all kinds of ways. Dignity law typically blurs the distinction between among the obligations that government has to protect everybody's dignity. Once you recognize that there are dignity rights, what you're saying is that the government has an obligation to protect your dignity. Sometimes that means just staying out of the way, not arresting you without due process, not making you stand or sit or whatever, not doing those things. And those are sort of negative rights. But sometimes it means the government has to take extra measures to protect people's dignity because it has been stressed, let's say, in a certain way. So people in vulnerable situations are going to require more from the government. Maybe they can't afford housing, so they're going to require the government to provide housing. They can't afford health care, they're going to require the government to provide it. So dignity law just says simply the government has an obligation to respect and protect everybody's dignity. Whatever that means in a given circumstance, that's what the government has to do. We're going to go quickly there. I wanted to again just draw attention to this also in combination with the slide that we had with this, so that you can sort of compare what this class produced, and it's not a fair comparison because I asked you to do this first thing before even talking, and my class had done this after a full semester of reading all these cases and everything, but just to sort of see how you articulated the different ways of articulating the dignity interest and what's missing from one and what's missing from the other. Okay. The last thing I wanted to say, who sent me an email with an article? Who sent me the, thank you. Okay. So I didn't mean to call you out, but just wanted to thank you. So this is the entirety of the lecture on criminal law. So he was kind enough to send me an article about a recent decision from the Kerala High Court. And the headline says, police cannot knock or barge into homes of history sheeters at night under the guise of surveillance. Okay? So, in a significant reaffirmation of citizens' rights to privacy and dignity, the Kerala High Court has held that police officers have no authority to knock on the doors or enter the homes of suspected individuals or history sheeters during the night under the pretext of surveillance. Justice V.G. Arun delivered the judgment while allowing a petition filed by a man who had been booked under charges of threatening police officers during a late night visit to his residence. The court quashed the FIR and all connected proceedings, emphasizing that such nighttime intrusions by the police are not legally justified. Quote, under the guise of surveillance, the police cannot knock on the doors or barge into the houses of history sheeters, the court said, adding that surveillance methods permitted under the Kerala Police Manual, such as informal watching and maintaining a close watch, do not authorize midnight home visits. Invoking the sanctity of personal space, the court remarked, every man's house is his castle or temple, the sanctity of which cannot be vilified by knocking on the door at odd hours. A person's right to life encompasses the right to live with dignity, and dignity, as Professor Vasanti just said a moment ago, is non-negotiable. The article goes on, but I just wanted to read to you up to that part. And what I just want to mention in the last few minutes is there are kind of an infinite number of ways in which the criminal law in most countries violates people's dignity, right? infinite in the sense that it's just hard to count or keep track of all the ways. Some of them are very obvious, like a lack of due process. Some of them are much less obvious, like standing or sitting, right? Or you can't cross your legs or whatever. In one of my clinic classes, I think I mentioned this to you yesterday, we produced a book which is on the website. It's a book that's a PDF that's downloadable for free. I'm not recommending that you do it just because it's very much about the criminal law in the United States, although it does quote some of your cases. But it's not directly relevant. But what I want to just mention is that what we did in that case was just try to map out everything that goes on in the criminal legal system. We actually didn't talk about trials themselves. We talked about the places where lawyers tend to not be. And just sort of mapped out how different practices violate dignity. And again, some of them are big, like in bail practices, and some of them are really small, just like how a police officer talks to you when they barge in to your house at night, or when they stop you on the street, and the different ways that a police can engage with you, for instance, just for instance. And we just mapped through the whole criminal legal system. And just to sort of reinforce what your professor was just saying a moment ago, you can use that and just sort of think about the different parts of a legal system and where dignity is or isn't, and where there might be sort of quick fixes to bring dignity to a system. How prisoners are treated, the conditions of release, how prisoners are expected to live with dignity after they're released, how they're expected to live with dignity during incarceration. So all of these steps, you can just sort of think of that. But I just wanted to thank you again for sending me that article, and I'll post it along with other things. I'll share it with you along with other things, but just so that you can see in that one sort of quick example how the courts in India are using the idea of dignity to stop practices, even certain practices that are arguably justified by law or by practice or by, police practice or whatever, using it to stop those practices that are violative of the inherent worth of and equal worth of each person. So with that, I will pause, unless there are any questions about this. So we will see you tomorrow morning at 11. All right. And if you do have any questions or anything, please feel free to email me or reach out anyway. Thank you.